I'm going to show you how to use REST and Orchestrator. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. This is part 10 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. Here in part 10, we're going to be looking specifically at Orchestrator. In the previous video, we saw how to invoke our REST operation by calling invoke a REST operation. We also saw how to generate a workflow automatically that would call whatever REST operation that we specified. Here in this video, we're once again going to create a workflow, but this time we're going to do it ourselves. So to do so, let's first of all, why don't we go back to card view and we will create a new workflow. We'll call our new workflow get one joke, and we can go with the default settings here. But what we want to do is go to the schema. I'm going to drag in a scriptable task, and I'm going to label this scriptable task parse JSON, and we'll see in a few moments what that's doing. But let's go back to our workflow that we're calling. So the workflow that we're calling is going to invoke a REST operation. So we're going to have to specify things such as which REST operation we want to call and other settings. So let's start with that first part. We're going to specify what REST operation to call. Now, the workflow that we're calling has an input called REST operation that will hold that information. We need our workflow to have a variable to store that information in. So I'm going to click on select variable. I have not yet already created a variable. If I wanted to, I could go to variables and create the variable, but I'm going to create a new variable right now on the fly by clicking create new. And we can use the same name that the other workflow is using, or we can change the name. We can change essentially anything we want except for the type. It has to be this type. So the REST operation that we're going to call needs to be specified here. So let's click on value. And when we click on value, this should look familiar. Once again, we see our two REST servers that we've added. If I expand the joke server, we can see the one and only REST operation that we've added. Let's go ahead and add that and click select. Once again, we'll click create. And now we've set up that one input to the invoke a REST operation workflow. As you can see, there's actually numerous other inputs to this workflow. There are a bunch of inputs called param _0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We do not need to set those for this specific workflow. If our REST operation required parameters, we could pass them in through these inputs. Additionally, there are some header parameters. Again, we don't need them for this example, so we're going to leave them blank. We do need to specify the default content type. So what kind of content are we sending? What's the data format? Well, we're going to send in JSON, so we're going to create a new variable. Again, we can choose the same name or a different name. I'll go ahead and use the same name. And I'm going to specify that we're going to be sending in JSON data. After all those header parameters, we also have acceptHeaders. Again, we need a new variable to hold what I'm about to enter here. I'll use the same name, and I'm going to specify, once again, application/JSON. So we're both sending JSON and we want to receive JSON, is effectively what I've just specified. When we call the invoke a REST operation workflow, it's going to send us back information, including a status code, the length of the body, the content that we're receiving. It could potentially send us back headers. These are request headers, these are response headers, not request headers. And additionally, we've got this variable here called contentAsString. So we're going to fill those out, starting with status code. That seems like a pretty reasonable name, so we'll go ahead and choose status code. I'm not going to bother setting the value here because the workflow is going to set the value in response to what it receives from the REST server. contentLength, again, I don't need to set this value. I do need a variable to store the answer in. I don't need to set the value because the workflow is going to set the value when it gets the response from the REST server. headers. I'm going to actually change the name of this one. I don't want to confuse the request headers with the response headers. So even though their variable name is more generic, I'm choosing what I think to be a more clear name for my variable. Again, I don't need to set the value because the workflow is going to set the value. And the last thing that we're going to set is called by the other workflow is called contentAsString. Again, I prefer a slightly different name here. Why don't we call this the response content or response body? This is where the answer is going to come back in the response. Now I realized as I was entering contentAsString, I must have missed one up above. So up here in the input section, content is the how you send in the request body. This specific REST operation doesn't require request body, so we're not going to send one in. I am, however, going to go ahead and create a variable to store my null body into. So this is the content of the request. Again, if it's helpful, you might call this the request body to be clear, but I'm going to leave it blank. All right, as you can see, we've filled out all the inputs and all the outputs. The only thing remaining here is how we're going to handle exceptions. So if there's a problem with this workflow that we're calling, where do we want to store the exception message? Well, it's traditionally done in a variable called error code. You can choose a different name if you want to, but I'm going to go with the traditional name error code. All right, so we've set up all the bindings, inward bindings, outward bindings, plus we also set up the exception handling for this workflow. What's left to do here is to do something with the response body that we get back. You'll recall in the previous video, the response body that we got back was just a string. Now it happened to be JSON formatted, but from our perspective, from Orchestrator's perspective, it was just a string. We need to parse up that string in order to pull out the individual pieces of info. So let's go edit parse JSON, and we are going to bring in the response body that we stored in the variable called response body. That way we can parse up what's in here and get from it whatever we need. So we've brought that in. I don't have any outputs for this particular schema element, and I don't anticipate there's going to be any errors, though if I wanted to, I could set up exception handling. What I do need to do is go over to the scripting tab, and we're going to start typing some code. I'm going to type var because I would like to define a variable. I'm going to define a variable called joke. This variable is going to store an object that describes one joke. So this joke is going to be this string that we're receiving, but it's not just going to be the string. We're going to use a special method to parse that string into its different pieces. So to do so, we're using the built-in object called JSON, and we're going to call the method JSON.parse. And what we're going to parse is that response body. So at this point, we now have a variable called joke that we can go through to easily access the different pieces of information that are coming back in that response body. So the way we do that is I'm going to define another variable here. Strictly speaking, this step's not necessary, but to get to the actual piece of data, we're going to type joke.type. So in this case here, the word type is a property of the joke object, and we're storing that joke type into a variable called type. Now we want to do essentially the same thing for the three other pieces of information in the object that we received back from the REST server. The four different pieces of information that we're going to get are the type, the joke setup, the joke punchline, and the ID of the joke. Again, at the beginnings of lines 3 through 6, I'm declaring variables so I can store the information that I'm just about to get by going to joke.id or joke.punchline or joke.setup. So lines 3 through 6 are extracting out of the parsed JSON string. We are extracting the four pieces of information that we want. now that we have those, we can use functions like system.log, or for reasons you'll see here in a moment, I'm going to use server.log, and I'm going to say exciting things like ID is, and then we'll just use that variable we defined up above. So the ID is ID. Now I want to do the same thing for the other 4 properties. So let me speed up this part of the video. And there you have it. We have code that will extract the 4 pieces of information from the response body and will log it to Orchestrator. Let's go ahead and validate this workflow, make certain that this is working correctly. So it looks like we don't have settings for those parameters that I mentioned before, so no surprise here. We're getting some warning messages. It's not actually going to stop us from running the workflow, but if you wanted to be really super duper careful, you would create a variable for each of those parameters, do the binding, leave the value blank, but you would set up a variable for each of those so that we could get these warning messages to go away. But again, these are just warning messages, so we should still be able to run this workflow. So when we run the workflow, as you can see here, it's prompting us to save our workflow. So let's go ahead and save it. And now it starts running the workflow, and the workflow has completed. Now we can go into the logs tab and see what happened. Now, if you want to, you can read through all the log information. In fact, I can see on this line here, here is the joke, but I intentionally did a server.log so that I could filter out anything like system.log. There we go. This is much easier to read. So we can see the 4 lines of information that we logged. So we know the ID of this joke that we got back. We know the type of joke. We know the setup of the joke. And we know the punchline. Now, the logs tab is showing us that information, but the point here isn't to log the information. The point of doing all this parsing is so that we could use that information we extracted elsewhere in our workflow. So we stuck that information into various variables. Now, as you can see, looking at the variables, many of these variables are ones that we have set up previously, such as restOperation, defaultContentType, and so forth. I'd like to draw your attention to response body. Again, when you see response body and it tells you it's a string, and boy, does this look like a JSON string, your natural inclination is going to be to think that you can just start working with this variable called response body. You're probably going to be tempted to say response body.type or response body.setup, which is not going to work because response body is not an object. It does not have methods. It doesn't have the ID method, does not have the type method, doesn't have the setup method, doesn't have the punchline method. This is not an object, so it doesn't have those properties. It's just a string. It looks like a JSON string, and it is a JSON string, but because this is a string and not an object, you can't pull out the individual pieces by simply saying response body.type. So the reason why we had that parse JSON scriptable task was so that we could get to these various pieces of information. And as you saw, we put those pieces of information into some local variables. Those variables I defined are not globally visible. They're only visible within the parse JSON schema element. That's why you don't see the type or ID or setup or punchline variables. Those are local variables that are local to the single schema element called parse JSON. Now, if you want those pieces of information to be available elsewhere in your workflow, well, you can do that easily enough. You just need to set up some outputs. So if we say that there is an output called, so it's going to be a new output called type, we won't need to set the value because the parse JSON schema element is going to set the value. You can set the variable names identical, which you can see me doing here. So the variable here matches the name of the variable inside the schema element. But for clarity, you might actually choose to intentionally have this variable have a different name. So again, instead of calling this joke type like we are doing inside the schema element, you could create a variable called joke type and another called joke ID and so forth. I'm going to do that for this one variable. The other 3 variables, I'm going to leave them as is. So in our outputs, I'm going to set up 3 more outputs. So the next output is going to capture the ID. Again, I'm going to use the same name that the variable is called inside the parse JSON schema element. And I'll do the same thing for the other 2 variables. Actually, I did not mean to create an input there. Let me delete that. I meant to create another output. So when we create the output, this time it's going to be an output called setup. So this is the joke setup. And finally, we'll add one more output. This output is going to capture the punchline. All right, so we have created 4 outputs. I personally like the one on top here best because the name of the variable that I chose for throughout the workflow is a lot clearer, I think, than the local variable. But I want you to be able to see how to do either using a name that matches or a name that intentionally doesn't match. So we've set up the outputs, and what we're going to do next is go back to the scripting tab. And in the scripting tab, you can see we've got these 4 outputs. And for most of them, I don't need to do anything special. Because notice when we grab the joke.setup property and we stick that into the local variable called setup, that local variable called setup has the same name as the output, and therefore we don't need to do anything tricky. The exception to this, though, is, actually let me put it down here on the bottom. So down below, I'm going to say that our output called joke type is equal to the local variable called type. Now I could have done this line number 13 elsewhere in this code. I could have done it anywhere from line 3 onwards. I decided to put it down here just to make it clear that we are passing back the joke type. Now again, you could say setup, the output, is equal to setup, the local variable, but since they happen to have the same name, it's not necessary. You can say punchline equals punchline, ID equals ID, but that's not necessary. It's only going to be necessary if the name of the output is different from the name of the local variable. All right, let's save this workflow. We'll run the workflow. The workflow's running. The workflow's completed. Again, if we go to the logs and take a look at just the server messages, we can still see we're getting the same information. But this time when we go to variables, we should have some more outputs listed here, including, starting here down on the bottom, we've got our joke type, our ID, our setup, and punchline outputs. And we could feed those outputs elsewhere in our workflow. Join me in the next video as we continue our exploration into REST and Orchestrator.